Welcome. Tonight, we travel along one of the most important networks of trade routes in human history, the Silk Road. For centuries, these routes connected distant civilizations across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. Caravans moved slowly across deserts, mountains, and valleys carrying goods such as silk, spices, metals, and ideas. Along the way, travelers stopped in small towns, trading posts, and quiet resting places. These journeys could take months, sometimes even years. But they followed a steady rhythm shaped by distance, landscape, and the movement of the seasons. Tonight, we will gently explore what life may have been like along the Silk Road. From the quiet mornings of caravan travel to the peaceful nights beneath the desert sky. Preparing for the journey. Before a caravan could begin its journey along the Silk Road, careful preparation was required. Merchants gathered goods such as silk, spices, tea, metals, and precious stones. These items were packed into bundles and carefully secured onto animals like camels and horses. Water supplies were just as important as trade goods. Travelers carried large containers to ensure they could survive long stretches between wells. Guides familiar with the terrain were often hired to lead the caravan safely across deserts and mountain paths. Once everything was ready, the long journey could begin. The caravan sets out. As the sun rises over the horizon, the caravan slowly begins to move. Camels step forward in steady rhythm, carrying goods across the open landscape. Merchants walk alongside, adjusting supplies and watching the road ahead. The journey is not rushed. Instead, it follows a slow and steady pace that can be maintained over long distances. Dust rises gently from the path as the caravan travels across plains and desert routes. Hour by hour, the travelers move forward, guided by experience and the knowledge of their route. The role of camels. Camels were among the most important animals along the Silk Road. Their ability to travel long distances without water made them ideal for desert journeys. Thick fur protected them from both the heat of the day and the cold of the night. Their wide feet allowed them to walk easily across sand. Camels could carry heavy loads, making them essential for transporting goods across vast distances. Without camels, many sections of the Silk Road would have been extremely difficult to travel. Crossing the desert. Some of the most challenging parts of the Silk Road passed through wide deserts. These landscapes stretched for miles, with little water and few landmarks. Travelers often moved early in the morning or later in the evening to avoid the intense heat of midday. Guides carefully navigated using knowledge of the land, stars, and distant landmarks. Caravans stayed close together for safety. Despite the harsh conditions, these routes were essential for connecting distant regions. Caravanserais along the route. Along the Silk Road, travelers found rest in places known as caravanserais. These were large roadside buildings designed to shelter merchants, animals, and goods. Inside the walls, travelers could rest, share meals, and exchange news. Animals were given water and allowed to recover from the journey. Caravanserais provided safety from the dangers of travel, including harsh weather and bandits. These resting places became important hubs along the trade routes. Trade and exchange. Trade was at the heart of life along the Silk Road. Merchants exchanged goods from many different regions. Silk from China, spices from India, glassware from the Middle East, and metals from Central Asia all moved along these routes. But it was not only goods that were exchanged. Ideas, technologies, and cultural traditions also traveled with the merchants. Through these interactions, distant civilizations became connected in new ways. Life in Silk Road markets. In cities along the Silk Road, markets became lively centers of activity. Merchants displayed goods brought from distant lands. Buyers examined fabrics, spices, jewelry, and tools. Different languages could be heard as people from many regions gathered together. The markets were places where cultures mixed and new ideas spread. Despite the busy atmosphere, there was also a steady rhythm to the trade that defined daily life. Traveling through the mountains. Not all parts of the Silk Road cross deserts. Some routes pass through high mountain ranges. Narrow paths wound through steep valleys and rocky terrain. Travel in these areas required caution and patience. Caravans moved slowly to avoid danger. The cooler air of the mountains offered relief from the heat of the plains. These routes connected regions separated by difficult terrain. Evenings along the Silk Road. As the sun begins to set, the caravan prepares to rest. Animals are unloaded and given water. Merchants gather together, sharing food and conversation. Fires are lit, casting a soft glow across the camp. The long journey pauses for the night. These moments of rest were essential for maintaining strength for the days ahead. The night sky over the caravan. When darkness settles across the landscape, the sky above becomes filled with stars. Without modern lights, the night sky appears incredibly clear. Travelers look upward, sometimes using the stars to guide their journey. The desert and mountains grow quiet. The caravan rests beneath the vast sky. For a few peaceful hours, the long journey pauses in silence. Goods of the Silk Road. The Silk Road carried an incredible variety of goods across continents. From the east came fine silk, lightweight and valuable, often reserved for royalty and the wealthy. Spices such as cinnamon, pepper, and cloves traveled from India and Southeast Asia. From the west came glassware, metal tools, and crafted goods. Precious stones, ivory, and perfumes also moved along these routes. Each item passed through many hands before reaching its final destination. Because of the long journey, these goods often became more valuable the farther they traveled. The importance of silk. Silk was one of the most famous products traded along these routes. Produced in China, silk was carefully woven from threads created by silkworms. The fabric was smooth, light, and strong. Because of its quality, silk became highly desired across distant lands. For many years, the process of making silk was kept a closely guarded secret. This made silk even more valuable and mysterious to those outside of China. The Silk Road itself was named after this important trade item. Languages along the route. As merchants traveled across the Silk Road, they encountered many different languages. Communication was not always simple. Some traders learned multiple languages to conduct business more easily. Others relied on translators or simple gestures to exchange goods. Over time, certain languages became more commonly used for trade. Despite these differences, the shared goal of trade helped people communicate and cooperate. Goods of the Silk Road. The Silk Road carried an incredible variety of goods across continents. From the east came fine silk, lightweight and valuable, often reserved for royalty and the wealthy. Spices such as cinnamon, pepper, and cloves traveled from India and Southeast Asia. From the west came glassware, metal tools, and crafted goods. Precious stones, ivory, and perfumes also moved along these routes. Each item passed through many hands before reaching its final destination. Because of the long journey, these goods often became more valuable the farther they traveled. The importance of silk. Silk was one of the most famous products traded along these routes. Produced in China, silk was carefully woven from threads created by silkworms. The fabric was smooth, light, and strong. Because of its quality, silk became highly desired across distant lands. For many years, the process of making silk was kept a closely guarded secret. This made silk even more valuable and mysterious to those outside of China. The Silk Road itself was named after this important trade item. Languages along the route. As merchants traveled across the Silk Road, they encountered many different languages. Communication was not always simple. Some traders learned multiple languages to conduct business more easily. Others relied on translators or simple gestures to exchange goods. Over time, certain languages became more commonly used for trade. Despite these differences, the shared goal of trade helped people communicate and cooperate. Cultural exchange. The Silk Road was more than just a trade network. It became a pathway for the exchange of ideas, beliefs, and traditions. Religions such as Buddhism spread along these routes. Art styles and technologies also traveled between regions. People who may never have met otherwise became connected through these exchanges. Over time, this cultural interaction shaped societies across continents. The rhythm of travel. Life on the Silk Road followed a steady rhythm. Caravans would travel for several hours each day. They would rest during the hottest parts of the afternoon. Evenings were used for preparing food, repairing equipment, and resting. This routine allowed travelers to conserve energy during long journeys. Day after day, the caravan continued forward at a calm and steady pace. The sound of the caravan. As the caravan moved, it created a quiet but constant sound. Footsteps pressed into sand and dirt. Bells attached to animals rang softly with each step. Voices of travelers rose and fell in conversation. The wind moved across the landscape, blending with these sounds. Together, these elements created the gentle background of life along the Silk Road. A calm night along the route. As night settles across the land, the caravan comes to rest. The fire burns softly as travelers prepare to sleep. Animals lie quietly nearby. Above, the stars stretch across the sky in great numbers. The long journey pauses for a few peaceful hours. In the quiet of the night, the Silk Road becomes still. The long distance of the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a vast network of routes stretching thousands of miles across continents. From the cities of eastern China, the paths extended westward through Central Asia, across deserts and mountains, and eventually reached the Mediterranean world. A single journey from one end to the other could take many months, and often years. Because of this, very few merchants traveled the entire distance. Instead, goods were passed from one group of traders to another along different sections of the route. At each stage, items were exchanged, repackaged, and carried forward. Over time, this system allowed products from one side of the world to reach the other, even if no single traveler made the full journey. The Taklamakan Desert. One of the most difficult regions along the Silk Road was the Taklamakan Desert. This vast desert in Central Asia was known for its harsh conditions and shifting sands. Travelers often avoided crossing directly through the desert. Instead, routes followed the edges where small oasis towns provided water and shelter. These oases became vital stopping points along the journey. Without them, crossing such a desert would have been nearly impossible. Caravans moved carefully between these points, planning each step of the journey in advance. Oasis towns. Oasis towns were some of the most important locations along the Silk Road. These settlements were built around natural water sources that allowed plants and crops to grow in otherwise dry regions. Travelers depended on these towns for food, water, and rest. Markets often formed in these areas, where merchants could trade goods and gather supplies. Because of their importance, oasis towns became meeting places for people from many different cultures. Here, languages, clothing styles, and traditions blended together. The transfer of goods. Because the Silk Road was so long, goods rarely traveled with a single caravan from beginning to end. Instead, they moved in stages. A merchant might carry silk or spices from one city to the next, where the goods would then be sold or traded to another group. This process repeated many times. With each exchange, the value of the goods often increased. By the time an item reached its final destination, it might have passed through many hands and traveled thousands of miles. The role of horses and camels. Different regions of the Silk Road required different animals for travel. In open plains and mountainous areas, horses were often used for speed and mobility. In desert regions, camels were preferred because of their ability to survive with little water. The Bactrian camel, with 2 humps, was especially suited for cold deserts and rugged terrain. These animals carried heavy loads across difficult landscapes. Their strength and endurance made long-distance trade possible. Weather along the Silk Road. travelers along the Silk Road experienced a wide range of weather conditions. In desert regions, the heat during the day could be intense, while nights became surprisingly cold. In the mountains, snow and freezing temperatures could make travel difficult. Storms sometimes forced caravans to stop and wait for safer conditions. Because of these challenges, timing and preparation were extremely important. Merchants often planned their journeys according to the seasons. Religion along the Silk Road. The Silk Road played an important role in the spread of religion. As merchants and travelers moved between regions, they carried their beliefs with them. Buddhism, in particular, spread from India into Central Asia and China along these routes. Monasteries were sometimes built near trade paths, offering rest and spiritual guidance to travelers. Other religions, including Zoroastrianism and later Christianity, also moved along the Silk Road. Through these interactions, spiritual ideas traveled across great distances. The slow passage of time. Life along the Silk Road moved at a slow and steady pace. Journeys were measured not in hours, but in days and weeks. Travelers became accustomed to the rhythm of walking, resting, and continuing again. The passing of time was marked by sunrise, sunset, and the changing of the landscape. This steady movement created a calm and predictable routine. Day by day, the caravan moved forward across the vast distances of the ancient world. The cities along the Silk Road. Along the long network of Silk Road routes, certain cities became important centers of trade and culture. Places like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Kashgar grew into busy hubs where merchants from many regions gathered. These cities offered markets filled with goods from distant lands. Travelers could rest, repair equipment, and exchange supplies. Because people from many cultures passed through, these cities became places where languages, traditions, and ideas blended together. Walking through one of these cities, a traveler might hear unfamiliar languages and see clothing styles from faraway regions. These urban centers became vital points connecting the long journey across continents. Samarkand as a trade center. The city of Samarkand, located in Central Asia, became one of the most famous stops along the Silk Road. Its location made it a natural meeting point for traders traveling between east and west. Merchants brought silk, spices, metals, and crafted goods into the city. Markets filled with activity as buyers and sellers exchanged items from distant lands. The city also became known for its skilled craftsmen and artisans. Over time, Samarkand developed into one of the most important cultural and economic centers along the Silk Road. The role of intermediary traders. Many merchants along the Silk Road did not travel the entire route. Instead, they specialized in specific sections. These traders acted as intermediaries, buying goods in one region and selling them further along the route. For example, a trader might purchase silk in Central Asia and transport it to a market closer to the Middle East. From there, another trader would continue the journey. This system allowed trade to function efficiently despite the enormous distances involved. The value of spices. Spices were among the most valuable goods traded along the Silk Road. Items such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were highly desired in many regions. They were used not only for flavoring food but also for preserving it. In some places, spices were so valuable that they were treated almost like currency. Because of their rarity and long journey, spices could become extremely expensive by the time they reached distant markets. The movement of ideas. The Silk Road allowed more than goods to travel. Ideas moved along these routes as well. New technologies, artistic styles, and forms of knowledge spread between cultures. For example, methods of papermaking and metalworking gradually traveled across regions. This exchange helped shape civilizations far beyond the places where these ideas first developed. The role of religion in travel. For many travelers, religion provided comfort during long and uncertain journeys. Shrines, temples, and monasteries were sometimes located along trade routes. These places offered travelers a chance to rest and reflect. Monks and priests sometimes provided food or shelter to those passing through. Religious symbols and practices from different cultures could often be seen along the Silk Road. The sound of wind across the desert. As caravans crossed open desert landscapes, one of the most constant sounds was the wind. It moved across the sand, shaping dunes and carrying fine dust through the air. Travelers walking alongside their animals could hear the wind shifting across the wide, open space. Combined with the quiet footsteps of camels and the occasional call of a guide, the sound created a calm and steady rhythm. A quiet evening at an oasis. After a long day of travel, reaching an oasis brought a sense of relief. Palm trees surrounded small pools of water, offering shade and rest. Caravans stopped to refill supplies and allow animals to drink. Travelers sat together, sharing food and stories. The busy journey slowed into a peaceful moment of rest. As the sun set behind the desert horizon, the oasis became quiet once again. The origins of the Silk Road. The Silk Road began to take shape during the Han Dynasty of China, around the 2nd century BC. One of the key figures in its early development was a Chinese envoy named Zhang Qian, who was sent westward to explore lands beyond China. His journeys revealed the existence of powerful civilizations in Central Asia and opened the possibility of long-distance trade. Soon after, Chinese silk began traveling westward, while horses, glass, and other goods moved east. Over time, these early exchanges grew into a network of trade routes that connected China with Central Asia, Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean world. The Han Dynasty and silk production. Silk production was one of the most closely guarded secrets of ancient China. The process, known as sericulture, involved raising silkworms that fed on mulberry leaves. These worms spun cocoons made of fine silk threads, which were then carefully unwound and woven into fabric. Producing silk required skill, patience, and careful control of temperature and environment. For many centuries, knowledge of silk production remained within China. Because of this, silk became one of the most valuable goods traded along the Silk Road. The Parthian Empire's role. Between Rome and China stood the Parthian Empire, which controlled much of Persia and Central Asia. The Parthians played a major role as middlemen in Silk Road trade. They often facilitated the exchange of goods between eastern and western regions. Roman traders rarely traveled all the way to China. Instead, goods passed through Parthian hands before continuing west. This allowed the Parthians to profit from trade while also controlling the flow of goods and information. Roman demand for Eastern goods. In the West, the Roman Empire developed a strong demand for luxury goods from the East. Silk, spices, and exotic items became symbols of wealth among Roman elites. Roman writers even complained about how much gold was leaving the empire in exchange for Eastern goods. Silk clothing, in particular, became highly fashionable despite its high cost. These trade demands helped drive the continued expansion of Silk Road connections. The Bactrian camel. One of the most important animals along the Silk Road was the Bactrian camel. Unlike the single-humped camel, the Bactrian camel has two humps and is well adapted to colder climates. It could carry heavy loads across long distances and survive extreme temperatures. These camels were especially useful in Central Asian deserts and mountainous regions. Their strength and endurance made them essential for maintaining trade routes across difficult terrain. The spread of Buddhism. One of the most important cultural exchanges along the Silk Road was the spread of Buddhism. Originally from India, Buddhist teachings traveled north and east along trade routes. Monks and travelers carried religious texts and ideas into Central Asia and China. Over time, monasteries were built along these routes. These monasteries often served as rest stops for travelers and centers of learning. The Silk Road played a major role in spreading Buddhism across Asia. Paper and knowledge transfer. One of the most important technologies to travel along the Silk Road was papermaking. Originally developed in China, paper eventually spread westward through trade and cultural exchange. By the time it reached the Islamic world and later Europe, it began to replace older writing materials like parchment. This innovation made writing more accessible and allowed knowledge to be recorded and shared more widely. The spread of paper had a lasting impact on education and communication. The city of Kashgar. Located at a crossroads of major trade routes, Kashgar became one of the most important cities along the Silk Road. It sat at the meeting point of routes that passed north and south of the Taklamakan Desert. Because of its location, Kashgar became a gathering place for merchants, travelers, and cultures from many regions. Markets in the city were filled with goods from across Asia and beyond. The city served as both a resting point and a trading hub for caravans. Risks and survival strategies. Travel along the Silk Road required careful planning and awareness. Caravans often traveled in groups for protection against bandits. Guides familiar with the terrain helped navigate deserts and mountain passes. Water sources were carefully mapped and followed. Travelers carried supplies to survive long stretches without access to fresh food or water. Despite these dangers, the rewards of successful trade encouraged merchants to continue these journeys. The long journey across continents. The Silk Road was not a single path but a network of routes that connected distant parts of the world. Goods moved gradually from one region to another, often taking months or years to reach their final destination. A piece of silk might begin its journey in China, pass through Central Asia, move into Persia, and eventually reach markets in the Mediterranean. Along the way, it would pass through many hands and cultures. The Kushan Empire and trade. One of the key powers along the Silk Road was the Kushan Empire, which controlled parts of Central Asia and northern India around the 1st to 3rd centuries CE. The Kushans played an important role in connecting trade between India, Persia, and China. They supported merchants and helped maintain safe trade routes through their territory. Under Kushan rule, trade flourished, and cities along their routes became prosperous centers of exchange. They also helped spread Buddhism further along the Silk Road, supporting monasteries and religious communities. The Dariem Basin routes. To avoid the harsh conditions of the Taklamakan Desert, Silk Road routes split into two main paths around the Dariem Basin. One route passed along the northern edge, while another followed the southern edge. Both routes connected oasis towns that provided essential water and supplies. These towns became lifelines for travelers crossing the region. Choosing which route to take often depended on political conditions, weather, and the availability of resources. The Sogdian merchants. Among the most important traders on the Silk Road were the Sogdians, a group of merchants from Central Asia. They became known for their skill in trade and their ability to travel long distances. Sogdian traders established networks that connected many parts of the Silk Road. They often acted as intermediaries between Chinese, Persian, and other merchants. Their language even became one of the common trade languages along parts of the route. Because of their role, Sogdians helped maintain the flow of goods and ideas across vast distances. Silk as a diplomatic gift. Silk was not only used for trade, it also played a role in diplomacy. Chinese rulers sometimes sent silk as gifts to neighboring kingdoms and nomadic tribes. These gifts helped build alliances and maintain peaceful relationships. In some cases, silk was used as payment to secure borders or ensure cooperation. Because of its value, silk became a powerful tool in both trade and politics. The Roman-Parthian connection. Although Rome and China were connected through the Silk Road, they rarely had direct contact. Instead, the Parthian Empire often controlled the middle sections of the trade routes. Parthian merchants managed much of the exchange between East and West. They sometimes limited direct contact to maintain control over trade profits. This indirect connection meant that goods traveled great distances without the empires themselves directly interacting. The spread of disease. Along with goods and ideas, the Silk Road also allowed diseases to spread between regions. One of the most significant examples occurred much later with the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century. Although this was long after the early Silk Road, it showed how connected these trade routes had become. As people, animals, and goods moved between regions, diseases could travel as well. This was one of the unintended consequences of long-distance trade. The role of nomadic tribes. Nomadic groups living across Central Asia played an important role in Silk Road history. Some groups protected trade routes and guided caravans through their territories. Others, at times, raided caravans or controlled key sections of land. These tribes were skilled riders and deeply familiar with the landscapes of the region. Their relationship with merchants could vary, but they remained an important part of life along the Silk Road. Chinese paper reaches the West. Paper-making technology slowly spread westward along the Silk Road. After reaching Central Asia, it eventually moved into the Islamic world. By the 8th century, paper production had begun in places like Samarkand. From there, it continued spreading into the Middle East and eventually Europe. This development made writing more accessible and contributed to the spread of knowledge across civilizations. The exchange of art and design. Artistic styles also traveled along the Silk Road. Designs, patterns, and techniques moved between cultures. For example, Central Asian art often showed influences from both Chinese and Persian styles. Textiles, pottery, and metalwork began to reflect these blended influences. This cultural exchange helped create new artistic traditions across regions. The enduring impact of the Silk Road. The Silk Road connected distant civilizations in ways that had never existed before. It allowed goods, ideas, technologies, and beliefs to move across continents. Although the routes changed over time, their influence continued for centuries. Even today, historians study the Silk Road to understand how early global connections were formed. The legacy of these routes remains one of the most important chapters in human history. The Tang Dynasty and the Silk Road. During the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, the Silk Road reached one of its most active periods. China's capital city, Chang'an, became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers from many regions gathered there. Goods from Persia, India, and Central Asia could be found in its markets. The Tang government supported trade and maintained stability along key routes. Because of this, long-distance exchange increased, and the Silk Road became more vibrant than ever. Chang'an, a global city. Chang'an was more than just a capital, it was a meeting place of cultures. Foreign merchants lived in special districts within the city. Different religions, including Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam, could be found there. Markets sold goods from distant lands, including glassware, spices, and textiles. The city's wide streets and organized layout made it a center of trade and administration. For many travelers, reaching Chang'an marked the eastern end of their long journey. The Islamic Golden Age in trade. As trade expanded westward, the rise of Islamic empires brought new energy to the Silk Road. Cities like Baghdad became centers of learning and commerce. Scholars translated texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine advanced during this time. Trade routes connected these intellectual centers with distant regions. Through these connections, knowledge spread alongside goods. The introduction of new crops. The Silk Road also helped spread agricultural products across regions. Crops such as grapes, citrus fruits, and certain grains moved between cultures. Farming techniques were also shared. This exchange allowed new foods to appear in regions where they had not previously grown. Over time, diets changed as new ingredients became available. The spread of technology. Many important technologies traveled along the Silk Road. In addition to papermaking, techniques such as silk weaving, glassmaking, and metalworking spread between regions. Gunpowder, originally developed in China, would later travel westward as well. These innovations shaped the development of civilizations far beyond their places of origin. The role of women in trade. Although much of the Silk Road is described through merchants and caravans, women also played roles in trade and daily life. In the 13th century, the rise of the Mongol Empire created a period of relative safety along the Silk Road. Under Mongol rule, large areas of Eurasia were united under one authority. This allowed merchants to travel more safely across long distances. The Mongols established systems that protected trade routes and supported communication. During this time, trade and cultural exchange increased once again. Marco Polo's journey. One of the most well-known travelers along the Silk Road was Marco Polo, a merchant from Venice. In the 13th century, he traveled eastward and spent many years in the court of the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan. His accounts describe the lands, cultures, and wealth of Asia. Although some details are debated, his journey remains one of the most famous examples of long-distance travel along these routes. The gradual decline of the Silk Road. Over time, the importance of the Silk Road began to decline. Changes in political stability made travel more difficult. New sea routes developed, allowing goods to be transported more efficiently by ship. As maritime trade increased, land-based routes became less central to global exchange. However, the influence of the Silk Road did not disappear. Its legacy continued to shape connections between cultures. The memory of the Silk Road. Even though the original routes are no longer used in the same way, the idea of the Silk Road remains powerful. It represents a time when distant civilizations became connected through trade and travel. The paths that once crossed deserts, mountains, and valleys helped shape the world we know today. The memory of these journeys continues to inspire historians and travelers alike. The Chinese silk monopoly. For many centuries, China maintained a near monopoly on silk production. The process of raising silkworms and weaving silk fabric was kept secret. Exporting silkworms or revealing the method was strictly forbidden. Because of this, silk remained rare and valuable in other parts of the world. Eventually, knowledge of silk production spread westward, but for a long time, China controlled this important industry. This gave Chinese merchants a strong advantage in trade along the Silk Road. Glass from the west. While silk moved westward, glassware became one of the important goods traveling east. Glassmaking techniques were highly developed in regions such as the Roman Empire and later the Middle East. Delicate glass vessels, beads, and decorative items were traded along the Silk Road. These objects were valued for their beauty and craftsmanship. For people in eastern regions, glass items could seem exotic and rare. The role of coinage and barter. Trade along the Silk Road used both coinage and barter systems. In some regions, coins made of gold, silver,
or copper were used to exchange goods. In other places, goods were traded directly for other goods. For example, silk might be exchanged for horses, spices, or precious metals. Because the routes crossed many different cultures, traders often needed to adapt to different systems of exchange. This flexibility helped trade continue across long distances. The use of pack animals. In addition to camels, other animals played important roles along the Silk Road. Horses were used in regions where speed and mobility were important. Yaks were used in high mountain areas where conditions were cold and rugged. Donkeys and mules carried goods along shorter or more difficult paths. Each animal was suited to specific environments along the route. Together, they made it possible to transport goods across diverse landscapes. The role of inns and shelters. In addition to caravanserais, smaller inns and shelters existed along some routes. These places offered basic rest for travelers. Food, water, and simple sleeping spaces were provided. Not all stops were large or well equipped. Some were small and remote, offering only the essentials. Even so, these locations were important for maintaining the flow of travel along the Silk Road. The art of navigation. Travelers along the Silk Road relied on a combination of experience, landmarks, and natural signs to navigate. Mountain ranges, rivers, and stars all helped guide their journeys. In desert regions, knowledge of the land was especially important. Getting lost could be dangerous due to the lack of water and resources. Guides and experienced merchants played a key role in ensuring caravans stayed on the correct path. The transmission of music. Music, like many other aspects of culture, traveled along the Silk Road. Instruments, melodies, and styles moved between regions. Musicians encountered new sounds and incorporated them into their own traditions. Over time, musical styles began to blend. This cultural exchange helped create new forms of artistic expression across different societies. The spread of textiles. Beyond silk, many types of textiles were traded along the Silk Road. Wool, cotton, and linen fabrics moved between regions. Each culture developed its own weaving techniques and patterns. These fabrics were used for clothing, decoration, and trade. Textiles often reflected the identity of the region where they were made. The role of climate and seasons. The timing of travel along the Silk Road often depended on the seasons. In summer, desert heat could become extreme. In winter, mountain passes could be blocked by snow. Merchants planned their journeys carefully to avoid the most difficult conditions. Seasonal knowledge was passed down among traders. Understanding the climate helped ensure safer and more efficient travel. The long endurance of the journey. Perhaps the most defining feature of the Silk Road was its length. Journeys required patience, endurance, and careful planning. Travelers spent weeks, months, and sometimes years on the road. Despite the challenges, the rewards of trade continued to draw merchants across these vast distances. The steady movement of caravans became part of the rhythm of life along the Silk Road. The legacy of trade networks. The Silk Road was one of the earliest examples of large-scale global trade. It connected distant civilizations that might otherwise never have interacted. Goods, ideas, and technologies moved slowly across continents. This network helped shape economies and cultures far beyond the regions it directly touched. Even though it was not a single road, its influence reached across vast distances. The legacy of these connections can still be seen in the cultural similarities and shared knowledge between regions today. The exchange of knowledge. Knowledge traveled along the Silk Road just as goods did. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering ideas moved between cultures. Scholars learned from one another as texts were translated and shared. This exchange helped advance learning across multiple civilizations. In many ways, the Silk Road acted as a bridge for human understanding. The role of religion in daily life. Religion was often a source of comfort for travelers along the Silk Road. Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian fire temples, and later Islamic centers offered places for reflection. Travelers could rest, pray, and recover from long journeys. These religious sites often became part of the landscape along the routes. They provided not only spiritual support but also physical shelter. The lasting influence of Silk Road cities. Many cities that grew along the Silk Road continued to thrive long after the peak of trade. Places like Samarkand and Bokhara remained important cultural centers. Their architecture, art, and traditions reflected centuries of exchange. Even today, these cities carry the history of their role in connecting civilizations. Walking through them now still reveals traces of their past importance. The quiet routine of travelers. Despite the vast scale of the Silk Road, daily life for travelers remained simple. Each day followed a pattern of waking, traveling, resting, and preparing for the next stage of the journey. This routine allowed caravans to move steadily across long distances. Over time, travelers became accustomed to this rhythm. The journey itself became part of their daily life. The endless horizon. Across deserts and plains, the horizon stretched far into the distance. Travelers often walked or rode for hours with little change in scenery. The vastness of the landscape created a sense of calm and stillness. This environment encouraged a slower pace of travel and thought. The journey became less about speed and more about steady movement. The final night on the Silk Road. Imagine one final night along the Silk Road. The caravan has stopped after a long day of travel. Animals rest quietly nearby. A small fire glows softly in the dark. Above, the sky is filled with stars stretching across the horizon. The long journey pauses for a moment of stillness. The world connected by the Silk Road. For centuries, the Silk Road brought together people from many different lands. Through trade, travel, and exchange, distant cultures became connected. The routes may have faded, but their impact remains. The Silk Road helped shape the world by linking civilizations across continents. The Silk Road in time. Travel along the Silk Road changed how people understood distance and time. Journeys that connected distant regions took months or even years to complete. Merchants became used to long periods away from home. Seasons passed as caravans moved slowly across deserts, mountains, and valleys. Time was measured not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the movement of stars, and the changing landscape. This slower sense of time shaped the experience of life along the Silk Road. The care of animals. Caring for animals was essential to survival along the Silk Road. Camels, horses, and other pack animals required regular rest, food, and water. Travelers paid close attention to their condition. An injured or exhausted animal could slow or endanger the entire journey. At each stop, animals were unloaded and allowed to recover. Their well-being was directly connected to the success of the caravan. The weight of goods. Every item carried along the Silk Road had to be carefully balanced. Too much weight could exhaust animals and slow progress. Too little would reduce the profit of the journey. Merchants carefully packed goods to maximize efficiency. Bundles were secured tightly to prevent shifting during travel. This careful balance between weight and value was an important part of trade. The changing landscapes. One of the most unique aspects of the Silk Road was the constant change in environment. A traveler might begin in fertile farmland, move into dry desert, and later pass through snowy mountains. Each region required different knowledge and preparation. Clothing, supplies, and travel methods often changed depending on the terrain.
This constant shift made the journey both challenging and fascinating. The memory of the journey. For many travelers, the Silk Road was more than just a trade route. It became a series of memories shaped by long days of travel and quiet nights under the stars. The faces of people met along the way, the cities visited, and the landscapes crossed all became part of the experience. Even after the journey ended, these memories remained. They connected individuals to distant parts of the world. A final moment of stillness. Now, imagine the Silk Road at complete rest. The caravan has stopped. The wind moves gently across the land. The fire has burned low. Animals sleep, and the voices of travelers have faded into silence. Above, the stars stretch endlessly across the night sky. For a brief moment, the long road is still. And in that quiet stillness, the journey comes to rest. The role of maps and memory. Unlike modern travelers, Silk Road merchants did not rely on detailed maps as we know them today. Instead, knowledge of routes was often passed down through memory and experience. Experienced guides remembered landmarks such as mountains, rivers, and oasis towns. Some routes were described through stories and directions shared between travelers. This knowledge became incredibly valuable. A skilled guide who knew the safest and most reliable paths could mean the difference between success and failure on the journey. The exchange of languages. Over time, certain languages became more common along the Silk Road. Languages such as Sogdian, Persian, and later Arabic were often used for trade and communication. Merchants sometimes learned basic phrases in multiple languages to conduct business. This mixture of languages created a unique environment where communication adapted to necessity. The need to trade encouraged cooperation despite cultural differences. The role of textiles beyond silk. While silk gave the Silk Road its name, many other textiles were equally important. Wool from Central Asia, cotton from India, and linen from Western regions were all traded. Each fabric had its own uses depending on climate and culture. Patterns and weaving techniques also traveled along these routes. Over time, textile designs began to reflect influences from multiple regions. The importance of water sources. Water determined the paths that caravans could take. Routes were often built around rivers, wells, and oasis towns. Without access to water, long-distance travel would not have been possible. Travelers carefully planned each stage of their journey around known water sources. Missing a well or oasis could be dangerous. Because of this, knowledge of water locations was one of the most important aspects of Silk Road travel. The quiet work of craftsmen. While merchants traveled, craftsmen in cities and villages worked to produce the goods being traded. Weavers created fabrics. Metalworkers shaped tools and decorative items. Potters formed vessels used in daily life. These individuals rarely traveled the Silk Road themselves, but their work moved across continents. Their craftsmanship connected them to distant lands through trade. The passing of generations. The Silk Road existed for many centuries, longer than the lifetime of any single traveler. Knowledge of the routes was passed from one generation to the next. Families of merchants continued the work of those before them. Skills, connections, and experience were shared over time. This continuity allowed the Silk Road to remain active across many generations. The feeling of distance. Travelers along the Silk Road often experienced a deep sense of distance. The journey could take them far from their homes for long periods. New languages, landscapes, and cultures surrounded them. Despite this, familiar routines of travel provided a sense of stability. Over time, the road itself became familiar, even as the surroundings changed. The final quiet road. At the end of a long journey, the road grows quiet. The movement of the caravan slows. The sounds of footsteps and wind fade into the distance. The vast network of paths that once carried goods and ideas become still. Though the journeys may end, the connections they created continue. And in the quiet of the night, the Silk Road rests once more beneath the stars. Thank you for joining this quiet journey along the Silk Road. Across deserts, mountains, and distant cities, these ancient routes connected people from many different cultures and worlds. Through trade, travel, and shared experience, the Silk Road became more than a path for goods. It became a bridge between civilizations. Even now, its legacy remains in the ideas, traditions, and connections that continue to shape the world. If you enjoyed this peaceful exploration of history, consider subscribing to Dreamtime History for more calm journeys through ancient life, cultures, and stories designed to help you relax and fall asleep. For now, rest well. And thank you for listening.